On the day David Cohen first saw Waddesdon Manor, a light English rain was falling, turning the Buckinghamshire landscape into a watercolor of grey and green. He was 32 years old, had just sold his third startup for a sum with 9 zeros, and was one of Silicon Valley's youngest billionaires. He was accompanied by Sarah, his wife, whom he'd met back in college when they were both nobodies. Just two ambitious students with borrowed laptops and dreams too big for their dorm rooms. Now, standing before the French Renaissance château that Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild had built in the 1870s, David felt something he hadn't experienced in years: inadequacy. The manor rose from manicured grounds like something transplanted from the Loire Valley, its pale stone glowing even under the overcast sky. There were towers, turrets, elaborate chimneys, and windows that numbered in the hundreds. The approach had taken them through landscaped gardens designed by a French landscape architect, past fountains and sculptures worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. A guide had told them the estate contained over 40 bedrooms, multiple drawing rooms, a smoking room, a billiard room, and collections of art and furniture that museums would kill for. It had taken 5 years to build, and had employed hundreds of craftsmen from across Europe. "Can you imagine building something like this today?" Sarah whispered as they stood in the entrance hall, staring up at a ceiling painted with classical scenes, supported by columns of rare marble. David couldn't, and that realization bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He had money now, more money than his parents. Immigrants who'd run a small dry-cleaning business in Queens could have ever imagined. More money than seemed real, honestly. The kind of money that appeared as numbers on screens, that moved through accounts and investments, and offshore structures his accountants managed. He could buy almost anything he wanted: cars, planes, houses in every major city. But standing here, in this monument to old wealth, he understood something fundamental had changed in the world. No one built places like this anymore. Not even the richest people on earth. The guide, an older British woman with the crisp accent of someone educated at proper schools, led them through room after room. Each space was a masterpiece: walls covered in silk damask, fireplaces carved from single pieces of marble, ceilings adorned with gold leaf and Renaissance paintings. The red drawing room contained furniture that had belonged to French kings. The Baron's room housed a collection of Renaissance art that would anchor any major museum. The wine cellars held thousands of bottles, some over a century old. Baron Ferdinand purchased this land in 1874, the guide explained, as they walked through the grand staircase, its walls lined with portraits of Rothschilds past. He was inspired by the château of the Loire Valley in France, where the family originated. The architect was Gabriel Hippolyte Destailleur, brought from Paris specifically for this project. Everything you see, the stone, the craftsmen, the furnishings, was brought from across Europe. No expense was spared. David did the math in his head. In today's money, accounting for inflation and the relative cost of skilled labor, the place would cost at least $300 million to build. Probably closer to 500. That wasn't the issue. He could afford that. Several tech billionaires could. But something else had changed. Something deeper than money. After the tour, they had lunch in the estate's restaurant, a modern addition housed in the former servants' quarters. Sarah was quiet, picking at her salad, and David knew that look. She was thinking, processing, preparing to say something he might not want to hear. "You're thinking about it," she said finally. "Building something." He couldn't deny it. For the past 6 months, ever since the sale of his company had gone through, he'd been restless. The money sat in accounts, being managed by wealth advisors who sent quarterly reports full of charts and projections. He'd bought a house in Atherton, California's most expensive zip code, but it was just a big modern box, all glass and steel, designed by an architect whose name impressed other rich people. It had cost $30 million and felt empty. He'd bought a penthouse in New York that he visited maybe twice a year. He had the cars, the watches, the wine collection. But none of it meant anything. None of it would last beyond his lifetime. None of it said, David Cohen was here, and he built something that mattered. Places like this don't exist anymore, he said, gesturing around them. No one builds them. Why? Sarah set down her fork. Because the world changed. Because that kind of wealth display is considered vulgar now. Because nobody wants to be seen as a robber baron anymore. But the Rothschilds were robber barons, David countered. They were bankers who financed wars and governments. They were probably more ruthless than any tech CEO today. But they built this, and now it's a national treasure. People come from around the world to see it. What are people going to visit from my generation? Our minimalist glass boxes? Our disruption and innovation? Maybe that's the point, Sarah said quietly. Maybe our generation's legacy isn't supposed to be buildings. Maybe it's the technology, the companies we create, the problems we solve. But David wasn't convinced. Technology aged instantly. The company he'd just sold would probably be obsolete in 5 years, acquired and broken up for parts, its innovations absorbed into something else. In 20 years, no one would remember it at all. But Waddesdon Manor had stood for nearly 150 years and would stand for 150 more. That was legacy. The rain had stopped by the time they left, and pale sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the manor's facade. David stood by their rental car, staring back at the building, and made a decision. He would build something. Not a tech company this time. Those were ephemeral, disposable. He would build a house, a real house, something that would outlast him, something that would make people stop and stare the way he'd stared at Waddesdon. Something that said wealth and power and permanence. He had no idea, standing there in the English countryside, how completely he would fail, or what that failure would teach him about the world, about wealth, and about the invisible forces that had made the age of grand estates impossible. The idea consumed him on the flight back to San Francisco. While Sarah slept in the fully flat first-class seat next to him, David opened his laptop and started researching. He looked at the great estates of the Gilded Age, the Vanderbilts Biltmore in North Carolina, the Breakers in Newport, Hearst Castle in California. He studied European palaces, Versailles, Schönbrunn, the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. He read about the Rothschild family's other estates, Mentmore Towers, Halton House, Château de Ferrières. Each one was a monument to wealth expressed through architecture, through beauty that would endure. He pulled up real estate listings for large parcels of land. Northern California had options, Napa Valley, Sonoma, the hills above Santa Cruz. He could buy 100 acres, maybe 200. Build something on a hilltop with views of the valley and the bay. He sketched ideas on his tablet. A neoclassical design, or maybe French chateau style like Waddesdon, or Italian Renaissance like the great Medici villas. The more he researched, the more excited he became. This would be his magnum opus, his statement to the world. Not another app or platform that would be obsolete in a decade, but something physical and permanent. Something his children and grandchildren would inherit. Something that would carry the Cohen name forward through centuries. By the time they landed at SFO, He'd filled 40 pages of notes. Sarah had woken up during the descent and watched him working with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You're really going to do this?" she said. It wasn't a question. "I am," he confirmed. She nodded slowly. "Okay, but promise me something. Promise you'll think about why you want this. Really think about it. Because building a monument to yourself, that's what you're talking about. Make sure it's for the right reasons." He promised, but he was already too excited to seriously consider her warning. In his mind, the house was already taking shape. Grand rooms filled with art and beauty, gardens that would be photographed and admired, a place where important people would gather, where history would be made. He imagined giving tours decades from now, an old man showing his grandchildren through rooms filled with treasures, telling them about the vision and effort that went into creating it all. The next morning, he called a meeting with his inner circle, his attorney, Richard Moss, who'd been with him since his first startup, his financial advisor, Jennifer Park, who managed his investments, and Marcus Webb, a real estate developer he'd worked with on several commercial projects. They gathered in the conference room of David's home office, a converted bedroom in his Atherton house that overlooked the pool. "I want to build a house," David announced. "Not a normal house, something significant, an estate." Richard leaned back in his chair, exchanging glances with Jennifer. Marcus, ever the optimist, pulled out his tablet and started taking notes. "How significant are we talking?" Jennifer asked carefully. "Waddesdon Manor significant," David said. "Have you seen it? The Rothschild estate in England?" "I know it," Marcus said, nodding. "Renaissance château, 40 plus. Bedrooms, built in the 1870s. Incredible place. You want to build something like that?" "Exactly like that. Here, in Northern California. I want it to be a landmark, something that lasts for generations." Richard cleared his throat. "David, before we get into details, I need to ask, have you thought about optics, about how this will be perceived?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, you're a tech billionaire in 2019, in the middle of a backlash against tech wealth and inequality. Building a massive estate, a personal palace, is going to attract attention. Not all of it good." "The Rothschilds built estates," David countered. "The Vanderbilts built estates. Hearst built a castle. These are celebrated now, tourist attractions, cultural landmarks." "They built them over a century ago," Jennifer interjected. "Different time, different social climate. Today, there's intense scrutiny on wealth inequality, on the concentration of money at the top, on billionaires paying less in taxes than their secretaries. Building a personal Versailles is going to look like Marie Antoinette saying, 'Let them eat cake.'" David felt his excitement deflating. "So what? Rich people just aren't allowed to build beautiful things anymore? We're supposed to hide our wealth, pretend we're just regular people living in slightly bigger houses?" "Not hide it," Richard said. "But there's a difference between wealth and ostentation. Look at how today's billionaires live. They buy expensive houses, sure, but they're modernist, understated, hidden behind gates and hedges. They don't build French châteaux visible from miles away." "That's exactly my point," David said, his frustration growing. "Everything is hidden now. Everything is tasteful and understated. Where's the grandeur? Where's the beauty? When did it become shameful to build something magnificent?" Marcus, sensing an opportunity, jumped in. "I think it can be done. It just needs the right framing. Don't call it a personal palace. Call it a cultural project. Build it with the intention of eventually opening it to the public, or turning it into a museum, or using it for charitable events. That way, it's not just about you, it's about creating something for the community." David considered this. It wasn't what he'd envisioned. He wanted a private sanctuary, not a public venue, but maybe Marcus was right. Maybe the key was positioning. "Let's explore it," he said. "Marcus, I want you to start looking for land, at least 100 acres, somewhere with views and privacy. Jennifer, work out the budget. I'm thinking in the 300 to 500 million range for everything. Land, construction, furnishings, landscaping. Richard, research the legal and tax implications. I want to know what structures we need in place." They all nodded, though Richard still looked skeptical. As the meeting broke up and the others left, Richard lingered behind. "David," he said quietly, "as your attorney and your friend, I'm advising you to really think about this. Not just the optics, but the practicality. You'll be 40 years old by the time it's finished, maybe older. These projects always run over time and budget. Do you really want to spend the next decade of your life managing construction? And once it's done, do you want to spend the rest of your life maintaining a 50-room mansion?" "The Rothschilds managed it," David said stubbornly. "The Rothschilds had family banking empires spanning continents and generations of accumulated wealth. They had dozens of staff, estate managers, and, most importantly, they lived in a time when having dozens of servants was normal and expected. How many people are you going to employ? 20? 30? How's that going to look in the age of income inequality?" David didn't have good answers to these questions, but he also didn't care. The vision had taken hold of him completely. He spent the next 3 months consumed by the project. Marcus found several properties that might work: a 150-acre parcel in Woodside with views of the bay, a 200-acre ranch in Napa Valley, a coastal property near Big Sur that was breathtaking but probably too remote. David visited them all, walked the land, imagined where the house would sit, how the approach roads would wind through the landscape, where the gardens would be laid out. He hired architects. First, he met with 3 of the biggest names in contemporary design, but their visions didn't match his. They showed him renderings of modern glass structures, organic forms that melded with the landscape, minimalist designs that emphasized sustainability and integration with nature. It wasn't what he wanted. He wanted columns and grand staircases, formal gardens, and elaborate stonework. He wanted Waddesdon, not another Silicon Valley tech mansion. Finally, through a contact in London, he found Anthony Caldwell, a British architect who specialized in classical design. Caldwell was in his 60s, educated at Cambridge, and had spent his career designing country houses for wealthy clients, mostly in England and Scotland. When they met at David's office, Caldwell brought a portfolio of his work: beautiful traditional homes that looked like they could have been built 2 centuries ago. "I don't do modern," Caldwell said bluntly in their first conversation. "I assume that's why you called me. You've seen the contemporary designs, and they don't appeal to you." "Exactly," David said. "I want something classical. French Renaissance, like Waddesdon Manor." "Have you seen it?" Caldwell smiled. "I've not only seen it, I studied it extensively at university. It's a masterpiece of the Rothschild aesthetic. French in style, but English in its landscape setting. Gabriel Hippolyte Destailleur designed it, brought over from Paris by Baron Ferdinand. Are you familiar with the construction details?" They talked for 2 hours. Caldwell explained the challenges of building in that style today: the shortage of skilled craftsmen who could do traditional stonework, the cost of importing materials, the complexity of integrating modern systems into a classical design. But he was enthusiastic. This was clearly the kind of project he'd always wanted to do. "I have to warn you," Caldwell said as they wrapped up. "This will be expensive. Not just the construction, but the ongoing maintenance. These houses weren't designed for energy efficiency or easy upkeep. They were designed for beauty and grandeur, with the assumption that you'd have a large staff to maintain them. Are you prepared for that reality?" "I am," David said, though he wasn't really thinking about maintenance. He was thinking about the vision, the completed house rising from landscaped grounds, the approach that would take visitors' breath away, the rooms filled with art and beauty. They settled on the Woodside property. It was 150 acres of rolling hills with oak trees and views that stretched from the bay to the Pacific on clear days. The land cost $42 million. Caldwell began working on designs immediately, and within 3 months he presented the first renderings. David stood in his office, looking at the images spread across his desk, and felt a surge of triumph. This was it. This was what he'd been imagining. The house was magnificent, a 3-story limestone structure with a steeply pitched slate roof, elaborate chimneys, and hundreds of windows. The main facade featured a central section flanked by 2 wings, creating a U-shaped courtyard. Grand staircases led up to the main entrance. The design called for 45 rooms, including a 2-story great hall, a library, a ballroom, a music room, multiple drawing rooms and bedrooms, and a basement level with a wine cellar, tasting room, and recreation facilities. The total floor space is approximately 60,000 square feet, Caldwell explained. The Great Hall rises 40 feet to a coffered ceiling. We'll source the limestone from a quarry in Indiana, the same source used for many significant American buildings. The roof slate will come from Vermont. For the interior, I'm proposing French oak paneling in the library and drawing rooms, Marble from Italy for the fireplaces and floors in the public spaces, and plaster ceiling work that will be done by craftsmen I know in England who specialize in historical restoration. How long will it take? David asked. 5 years minimum. Possibly 7 or 8 if we run into complications. This isn't a standard construction project. Every detail has to be custom-made, every piece of stonework individually carved. We'll need to bring in specialists from Europe for certain elements. And the cost? Caldwell hesitated. My preliminary estimate is $380 million for the house itself. That doesn't include the landscaping, which will be substantial, or the furnishings and art you'll need to fill it properly. All in, you're looking at $500 million, possibly more. David had expected high numbers, but hearing them stated so directly still made him blink. $500 million. For a house. He owned houses that cost $50 million, and they felt extravagant. This was 10 times that. But then he thought about the Rothschilds, about the Vanderbilts, about all the great builders of the past. They hadn't built timidly. They'd built boldly, creating landmarks that lasted. That was what he wanted. Let's do it, he said. Sarah's reaction was less enthusiastic. When he showed her the renderings that evening, spreading them across their dining table, she studied them in silence for a long time. It's beautiful, she finally said. But David, this is a palace, not a home. It'll be both, he insisted. We'll live there, raise the kids there. They had 2 children, Emma, who was 6, and Michael, who was 4. Both were currently in a progressive private school in Palo Alto, where the other parents were also tech executives and VCs. Sarah had suggested they might want to move to the city once the kids were older to expose them to more diversity, more real-world experience. Now, David was proposing to move them to an isolated estate in Woodside. Think about what you're saying, Sarah continued. You want to raise our kids in a 45-room mansion staffed by dozens of people? You want them to grow up thinking that's normal? The Rothschild children turned out fine, David said defensively. The Rothschild children were born into that world, Sarah countered. They were part of a banking dynasty that had operated that way for generations. It was normal for them, part of their social class and time period. Our kids? They're going to go from a normal childhood to living in a museum. And for what? So you can have bragging rights about owning the biggest house in California? That's not what this is about, David said, feeling his anger rise. This is about building something meaningful, something that lasts. I'm tired of creating companies that get acquired and dismantled, products that become obsolete in 5 years. I want to build something permanent, something beautiful that people will still admire 100 years from now. Sarah was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. I understand that impulse. I really do. But I think you're chasing the wrong thing. The Rothschilds didn't build Waddesdon to create a legacy. They built it because that's what people of their class did in that era. It was expected. It was normal. They had the money, the staff, the social structure that supported that kind of lifestyle. We don't live in that world anymore. Then maybe we should, David said stubbornly. The argument ended in a stalemate, but David pressed forward with the project. He hired a landscape architect, Thomas Hartley, who'd designed gardens for several major estates in England. Hartley flew out to California and spent a week walking the Woodside property, sketching ideas, talking about sight lines and seasonal plantings, and how to create a sense of arrival. The approach is everything, Hartley explained as they stood on a hilltop where the house would eventually sit. You want visitors to experience a journey, a gradual revelation. We'll create a drive that winds through the property for nearly a mile before reaching the house. Plant trees to create a canopy effect, open up vistas at strategic points, and then, finally, the house reveals itself in full glory. That's how Waddesdon works. That's how all the great estates work. He proposed formal gardens behind the house, terraced down the hillside with fountains and statuary, a rose garden to the east, a woodland garden to the west, greenhouses for exotic plants, an orchard, a lake. His estimate for the full landscaping plan came to $75 million and would take nearly as long as the house itself to complete. David approved everything. He was operating in a kind of fever dream now, driven by the vision of what it would all look like when finished. He barely noticed Sarah's increasing distance, or the concerned looks from his friends and advisors. He'd reduced his involvement in his other business interests to almost nothing, delegating to managers and partners. The estate consumed him. Construction began in the spring of 2020. The timing couldn't have been worse. Within 2 months, COVID-19 shut down the world. Construction halted as lockdowns went into effect. Workers couldn't travel. Materials couldn't ship. Supply chains collapsed. David watched his project freeze, millions of dollars already spent on land and designs, with nothing to show but cleared ground and foundation excavations. The pandemic lasted longer than anyone expected. Construction restarted in fits and starts throughout 2020 and 2021, but it was nothing like the schedule Caldwell had projected. Workers got sick, quarantined, quit. The cost of materials skyrocketed. Lumber prices tripled, copper and steel became scarce and expensive. Everything took longer and cost more than projected. But the pandemic did something else, something David didn't anticipate. It changed the social conversation around wealth in profound ways. As millions lost jobs and businesses failed, as people died and hospitals overflowed, the contrast between the struggling masses and the billionaire class became impossible to ignore. The wealth of the richest Americans grew by trillions during the pandemic, while everyone else suffered, and the scrutiny, the anger, the demand for change grew louder. David started seeing articles about tech billionaires buying bunkers in New Zealand, building compounds in Hawaii, buying up farmland across the Midwest. Each article had a tone of disgust, of outrage. The comments sections were vicious. People were angry, and that anger was directed at people like him. His own project leaked somehow. Maybe a construction worker. Maybe a permit filing that some journalist found. In September 2021, an article appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle. Tech billionaire building $500 million estate, while thousands live on streets. The piece was devastating. It detailed David's wealth, his background, and then described the Woodside project in damning terms. It compared the square footage of his planned house to the number of homeless people who could be housed with that money. It interviewed construction workers who'd been laid off from other projects during the pandemic, while David's estate continued to employ dozens at premium wages. The article went viral. Twitter exploded with commentary, almost all of it negative. David was called a modern robber baron, Marie Antoinette, a perfect example of everything wrong with tech wealth. His Wikipedia page was edited to highlight the estate project. He started receiving death threats. His children's school received angry calls from other parents, demanding he be asked to leave. Sarah had seen enough. One evening, she sat him down in their Atherton house and spoke with a firmness he'd rarely heard from her. "This has to stop," she said. "The estate project. It's destroying us. The kids are getting bullied at school because their classmates' parents talk about you. I can't go anywhere without people recognizing me and making comments. And you're not even here anymore. Physically you are, but mentally you're completely absorbed in this project. When was the last time you read Emma a bedtime story? When was the last time you played with Michael?" David wanted to argue, but he couldn't. She was right. The project had consumed him to the point where he'd lost track of everything else. But stopping now, after already spending over $200 million on land and initial construction, felt impossible. "I can't just walk away," he said. "We're already committed. The foundations are poured. The steel frame is going up. If I stop now, I lose everything we've invested." "Then finish it and sell it," Sarah said. "Or turn it into something else. A hotel, a museum, I don't know. But we can't live there. I won't raise our kids in a monument to your ego." The words stung because they were true. That's what the estate had become. Not a home, not even really a legacy project, but a monument to his ego, his need to prove he could build something as grand as the robber barons of old. And in trying to prove that, he'd demonstrated exactly why people didn't build this way anymore. He went to Woodside the next day to see the construction site. The frame of the house was up now, steel and concrete forming the skeleton of what would eventually be wrapped in Indiana limestone. It looked massive even as a frame, 3 stories of structure rising from the hilltop, visible for miles. Cranes towered over it, and dozens of workers in hard hats moved around the site. The foreman, a man named Bill Rodriguez, who'd worked on major projects across California, gave David a tour. "We're about 8 months behind schedule," Bill explained as they walked through what would eventually be the Great Hall. "The pandemic set us back. Plus, some of the custom work is taking longer than expected. The stonework in particular. The masons we brought in from Europe had visa issues, and the American craftsmen don't have the same skill level for this kind of detailed carving." They climbed temporary stairs to the second floor, where bedroom suites were being framed out. Bill pointed out the complications. The plumbing and electrical systems that had to be integrated into a design meant to look historical. The HVAC systems that would be needed to heat and cool 60,000 square feet efficiently. The fire suppression systems required by modern building codes. "Honestly, Mr. Cohen," Bill said, "I've been in construction for 30 years, worked on some big projects. But this is different. We're trying to build something that belongs in the 19th century using 21st century codes and regulations. It's like trying to write a letter with your feet. Sure, you can do it. But why would you?" David didn't have a good answer. He thanked Bill and walked the property alone, ending up at the spot where the formal gardens would eventually be laid out. He could see the bay in the distance, the sun setting behind the coastal range, painting the sky in oranges and purples. It was beautiful. The house, when finished, would be positioned to capture this view perfectly. Visitors would stand in the Great Hall or on the terrace and see this vista framed by classical architecture and formal gardens. It would be magnificent. But Sarah was right. It would also be empty. A beautiful shell housing a family that didn't need or want this much space, maintained by dozens of staff, consuming resources on a scale that felt increasingly obscene. And more than that, it would be a target. A symbol of everything wrong with wealth inequality. A place people would drive by and point at with anger and resentment. The Rothschilds had built Waddesdon in a different world, one where the class system was accepted as natural and inevitable, where great wealth was expected to manifest in grand estates, where the existence of servants and workers maintaining aristocratic lifestyles was seen as the proper order of things. That world was gone, and trying to recreate it wasn't building a legacy. It was building a museum to a dead social order. Over the next month, David had a series of conversations with his advisors, with Sarah, and with himself. He visited other major estates built by tech wealth, Larry Ellison's properties, Eric Schmidt's various homes, the compounds owned by other billionaires. They were large, certainly, some over 20,000 square feet. They were expensive, often $50 to $100 million. But none of them were palaces. None of them were trying to recreate Versailles or Waddesdon. They were, as Richard had said, understated, hidden behind gates and hedges, designed not to be seen. There was a reason for that, David finally admitted to himself. It wasn't that modern billionaires lacked the money or ambition to build grand estates. It was that they understood something fundamental. The social contract had changed. Extreme wealth was tolerated, even celebrated in some circles, but only if it was somewhat hidden, if it at least pretended to be normal. Building a palace wasn't just bad optics. It was a violation of the unspoken agreement that allowed billionaires to exist without being eaten by the masses. He called a meeting with Caldwell, Marcus, Jennifer, and Richard. They gathered at the construction site on a cold December morning in 2021. "I need options," David told them, "for pivoting this project into something else." Caldwell looked pained. "We're nearly a third of the way through construction. The structure is up. The exterior stone is starting to go on. Stopping now or changing direction will be incredibly expensive." More expensive than continuing? David asked. The architect was silent. Marcus jumped in. We could turn it into a luxury hotel. That's actually a viable business model. Look at what Auberge Resorts does with converted estates. With this location and level of quality, you could charge $5,000 a night easily. Might even recoup some of your investment over time. Or a museum and event venue, Jennifer suggested. You donate it to a nonprofit you control, get a massive tax deduction, and use it for charitable events and fundraisers. That flips the narrative completely. Instead of a personal palace, it becomes a cultural institution. There's precedent, Richard added. The Getty Villa, Hearst Castle, both started as personal projects and became public institutions. Admittedly, after the owners died, but still. David listened to them strategize, feeling a strange sense of relief mixed with failure. He'd wanted to build something magnificent, something that would last. Instead, he'd learned an expensive lesson about why certain things belonged in the past. What if, he said slowly, we finished it, but designed the completion with institutional use in mind from the start? Not a home pretending to be a museum someday, but a museum from day one that happens to have been funded by me. Caldwell leaned forward, interested now. That changes everything. We don't need 45 bedrooms for guests if it's a museum. We can convert most of those spaces to galleries and exhibition rooms. The Great Hall becomes a reception space for events. The ballroom is perfect for concerts and lectures. The library becomes an actual research library, maybe focused on architecture and design history. And it solves the social problem, Richard added. You're not building a personal palace anymore. You're building a cultural institution that happens to be in a beautiful building. Silicon Valley doesn't have anything like this. The closest is the Getty in LA. This could be Northern California's great art and architecture museum. Over the next weeks, the plan took shape. The Cohen Institute for Architecture and Design. That's what they would call it. David would continue funding the construction, but design it from the start as a museum and cultural center. Parts of it would house his personal art collection, which had grown substantially over the years. Other sections would have rotating exhibitions, programs for students, symposiums on architecture and preservation. There would be a restaurant, a gift shop, public gardens. It would be open to the public, though probably with timed entry and admission fees to manage crowds. The shift changed everything about the project. Suddenly, instead of interviews condemning him for building a palace, journalists were writing positive pieces about his cultural philanthropy. Architecture critics, who dismissed the project as a vanity exercise, now praised his vision for creating a West Coast center for classical design. The social media backlash evaporated, replaced by curiosity and anticipation. Sarah softened once it was clear they
wouldn't be living there. This makes sense, she admitted. It's still a massive expenditure, but at least it serves a purpose beyond just housing us. Construction continued with renewed purpose through 2022 and 2023. The exterior came together beautifully, Indiana limestone carefully carved and fitted, the slate roof installed by specialists who'd worked on historical restoration projects across Europe, windows custom-made to historical specifications. Inside, instead of private bedrooms, they built gallery spaces with proper lighting and climate control for art. The Great Hall became a public atrium. The library was designed to actually function as a research library with proper cataloging systems and study areas. David threw himself into building the collection and programming. He bought art, not just for investment, but pieces that fit the mission of showcasing architectural drawing, design history, and decorative arts. He hired a director with museum experience, Dr. Patricia Valdez, who'd previously worked at the Getty and the Met. Together they planned the opening exhibitions, the education programs, the calendar of events. But even as the project transformed into something more socially acceptable, David couldn't shake a feeling of loss. Walking through the nearly completed building in the fall of 2023, he realized what he'd really wanted wasn't just a house or even a museum. He'd wanted to live in the past, in a world where wealth could manifest in pure beauty without apology, where building a palace was seen as noble rather than grotesque. He'd wanted to be a Rothschild or a Vanderbilt, a great builder whose vision shaped the landscape for generations. Instead, he'd learned that world was truly gone, not just socially unacceptable, but actually impossible to recreate. Even building the museum version had been fraught with complications that didn't exist in the 19th century. Environmental regulations meant extensive impact studies and mitigation measures. Labor laws meant treating workers as employees with rights and benefits rather than servants. Building codes required modern safety systems that were expensive and complicated to integrate into classical design. And the sheer cost, even with economies of scale from framing it as an institutional project, the total was approaching $600 million, and the ongoing annual maintenance and operations would run $20 million or more. The Cohen Institute opened in May 2024 with a gala attended by politicians, tech executives, museum directors, and cultural figures. The reviews were mostly positive. Architecture critics praised the quality of craftsmanship while noting it was essentially a pastiche of 19th century design. Museum professionals welcomed a new institution with significant resources. The public seemed genuinely interested. The first month saw 15,000 visitors. David stood at the opening gala in the Great Hall, watching well-dressed people mill around with champagne, looking at the inaugural exhibitions, and felt oddly empty. He'd spent 5 years and $600 million on this project. It was beautiful. It served a purpose. It would likely last for generations. But it wasn't what he'd wanted. It was a compromise, an adaptation to a world that didn't allow for the kind of grand personal vision he'd been chasing. Sarah found him standing alone near one of the tall windows, looking out at the gardens that were still being completed. "You okay?" she asked. "I don't know," he admitted. "I built what I set out to build, more or less, but it doesn't feel like I imagined." "Because it's not yours," Sarah said gently. "Not really. It's the public's now. That was the only way to make it acceptable." "The Rothschilds didn't have to make it acceptable," David said. "They just built what they wanted." "The Rothschilds lived in a world with different rules," Sarah reminded him. "A world where the masses had no voice, where aristocracy was simply accepted. You're nostalgic for a social order that was actually pretty terrible for most people." David knew she was right, but the realization didn't make him feel better. He'd learned the lesson his project was meant to teach him. Grand estates weren't possible anymore, not because billionaires lacked money, but because the social infrastructure that supported them no longer existed. No amount of wealth could recreate the world of servants and craftsmen and unquestioned aristocratic privilege that made places like Waddesdon possible. In the months after the opening, David found himself visiting the Institute less and less. It was operational now, run by Dr. Valdez and her staff. It didn't need him except for fundraising and board meetings. He'd created something that would outlast him, but he felt curiously disconnected from it. He started spending more time with his family, trying to rebuild the relationships that had frayed during his obsession with the project. Emma was
10 now, Michael 8. They'd been patient with his absence, but he could see the distance in their eyes. He'd missed 2 years of their lives chasing a dream that turned out to be an illusion. One evening, in his Atherton house, the modern glass box he'd once dismissed as soulless, he was reading Michael a bedtime story when his son asked him about the big house he'd built. "Do you like it there?" Michael asked. "The museum?" "I'm proud of it," David said carefully. "It's beautiful, and it serves a good purpose." "But do you like it?" Michael pressed. "Like, if you could, would you want to live there instead of here?" David thought about the question. The honest answer was no. The Institute was magnificent to visit, but actually living in 60,000 square feet with 45 rooms would be absurd. Their family of 4 lived comfortably in 8,000 square feet. They didn't need or want more. The appeal had never really been about living space. It had been about the statement, about building something that said, "I am significant." "No," he told his son. "I like living here, with you and Emma and Mom. The Institute is for other people to enjoy." "Then why did you build it?" Michael asked, with the straightforward logic of an 8-year-old. "That," David said, "is a very good question." He didn't have a simple answer. Over the following year, as the Institute found its footing and became a legitimate cultural institution, David found himself reflecting on the whole experience. He'd set out to build a palace like the Rothschilds, driven by a desire for permanence and legacy that felt impossible in the fast-moving tech world. He'd ended up creating something quite different, a public museum housed in a classical building, accessible to anyone with an admission ticket. In a way, he'd succeeded in his original goal. The building would last for generations, would bear his name, would be a landmark. But the path to that success had required abandoning the core of what he'd wanted. Private grandeur, personal magnificence, the kind of wealth display that the robber barons had considered normal. He started researching what had happened to the other great estates, not just the famous ones like Waddesdon and Biltmore that became museums, but the hundreds of others built during the Gilded Age and its European equivalent. Most had been demolished. The cost of maintaining them became unsustainable. Heirs who inherited them couldn't afford the upkeep. Tax laws changed, making them financial burdens. Social attitudes shifted, making them embarrassing rather than impressive. Of the ones that survived, almost all had become institutions: museums, hotels, schools, corporate headquarters, government buildings. Private families simply couldn't sustain them anymore. The world had changed too much. The economic model of having dozens of servants, the social acceptance of ostentatious wealth, the building traditions that made such places possible, all had vanished. David came across an interview with the current Baron Rothschild, who still lived at Waddesdon, but only in a small private apartment, with the rest of the estate run by the National Trust. The Baron described it as living in a museum, being a caretaker of history rather than a true owner. Even the Rothschilds, with centuries of accumulated wealth and tradition, couldn't maintain the estate as a private family home in the 21st century. That realization crystallized something for David. The reason billionaires stopped building mansions like Waddesdon wasn't primarily about money, or even social acceptance. It was because the lifestyle those buildings represented was simply obsolete. Modern wealthy people didn't want to live in museums, didn't want to employ small armies of staff, didn't want the responsibility and burden of maintaining architectural landmarks. They wanted nice houses, certainly, large, comfortable, well-appointed, but they wanted houses that could be maintained by a small staff, or even just good technology. They wanted privacy and security, not visibility and grandeur. They wanted to be able to travel without worrying about massive estates deteriorating in their absence. They wanted to invest their wealth in things that generated returns, not in money pits that consumed millions annually in maintenance. The more David thought about it, the more he realized that the old robber barons hadn't been better or bolder than modern billionaires. They'd simply lived in a different economic and social reality. Building grand estates made sense in their context. It was expected. It was how wealth was displayed and legitimized, and the infrastructure to maintain such places existed. In the modern world, that infrastructure was gone, and the social expectations had inverted. Now, Wealth was expected to be somewhat hidden, to at least gesture toward normalcy and relatability. He started writing down his thoughts, not for publication, but just to process the experience. The document grew to 50 pages, then 100, as he traced the history of grand estate building from the Renaissance through the Gilded Age and into the present. He analyzed the economic factors, the social structures, the technological changes that had made such buildings first possible and then obsolete. One insight stood out. The real luxury in the modern world wasn't space or grandeur, but time and freedom. The old estates had been beautiful prisons in many ways. Their owners were tied to them, obligated to maintain them, expected to entertain in them. The social calendar of an aristocrat in the 19th century was rigorous and demanding. You couldn't just travel on a whim. Closing a great house for months required an elaborate process of covering furniture, banking fires, managing staff who couldn't simply be dismissed and rehired. Modern billionaires, by contrast, could move freely. They could have houses in multiple cities and visit them as needed. They could travel constantly, work from anywhere, live location-independent lives. A mansion like Waddesdon would have anchored them, demanded their attention and presence. The freedom that wealth provided in the modern era was incompatible with the responsibilities that came with maintaining a palace. David shared some of these thoughts with Dr. Valdez during one of their quarterly board meetings. They were sitting in what had been designed as a private study, but was now her office in the Institute, looking out at the gardens where spring flowers were beginning to bloom. "You know what's ironic?" Patricia said. "The Institute only works as a museum, because it was never really lived in. We didn't have to overcome decades of private family use, didn't have to convert spaces that had deep personal meaning. You built it as a museum from day one, essentially, even if that wasn't the original plan. That's why it's successful." "So all those years I spent thinking I was building my dream house," David said. "I was actually just taking an expensive detour to the same destination?" "Maybe," Patricia said with a slight smile. "Or maybe the journey was the point. How many tech billionaires think about these questions? Most of them just buy big modern houses and don't reflect on what they're doing or why. You asked the hard questions. You pushed until you found the limits of what's possible. That has value, even if the answer wasn't what you hoped for." David wasn't sure he agreed, but he appreciated the perspective. The Institute was thriving in its second year of operation. Attendance was strong, the programs were well received, and they'd already started planning an expansion, a modern wing that would provide additional gallery space and better educational facilities. The irony wasn't lost on David that the expansion would be contemporary in design, all glass and steel, a stark contrast to the classical main building. "We're designing it to be a dialogue," Patricia explained, showing him the renderings. "The original building represents historical approaches to architecture and beauty. The new wing represents contemporary approaches. Together, they tell a complete story about how we think about design and space." David approved the expansion, another $70 million, but he was less emotionally invested this time. The Institute was Patricia's project now, not his. He was just the benefactor, the name on the building. His attention had shifted to other things. Emma was now 11 and showing an interest in environmental science. She'd started asking uncomfortable questions about her father's carbon footprint, about the private planes and multiple houses, about whether it was right for one family to consume so many resources. David found himself unable to give her the easy, dismissive answers that many wealthy parents offered their children. He'd been forced to confront these questions through the estate project, and he couldn't unknow what he'd learned. He started making changes. Not dramatic ones. He wasn't about to give away his wealth or move into a modest suburban house, but smaller, thoughtful changes. He sold 2 of his properties that he rarely visited. He started flying commercial for most trips, saving the private plane for times when it was genuinely necessary. He got more involved with his charitable foundation, which he'd previously treated as a tax optimization vehicle, turning it into something that actually tried to address problems. Sarah noticed the changes. "You're different," she said one evening. "Not just since the Institute opened, but in the last few months especially. More present, more thoughtful." "I wasted 5 years chasing something that was never real," David said. "I don't want to waste any more time." They were sitting on their back patio, watching the sunset, the same kind of sunset he'd once imagined watching from the terrace of his grand estate. The view from their regular house was fine. It didn't need to be framed by classical architecture to be beautiful. "I've been thinking," Sarah said carefully, "about what we want the next 20 years to look like. The kids will be grown and gone in another decade. What do we do then? Keep accumulating wealth? Keep buying things? Or do we actually try to do something meaningful with what we have?" It was a conversation they'd avoided for years, but David was ready for it now. They talked late into the night about possibilities. Not grand gestures like building museums, but practical interventions in areas they cared about. Education, environmental protection, housing affordability problems that money could actually help solve if applied intelligently. Over the next year, David became genuinely engaged in philanthropy for the first time. Not the check-writing kind that most billionaires did, but the hands-on kind that required learning about problems in depth and working with people who dedicated their lives to solving them. It was humbling. These were complicated issues that couldn't be solved just by throwing money at them. But unlike building a palace, this work felt meaningful in a way that scratched the itch he'd been feeling all along, the desire to create something that would outlast him and matter to people beyond himself. He met James Chen through this work. James ran a nonprofit focused on affordable housing in the Bay Area, and David's foundation had started funding some of their projects. James was David's age, but his path had been completely different: public school, state college, a decade working in city planning before starting the nonprofit. He lived in a modest house in Oakland with his wife and 3 kids. His annual salary was a tiny fraction of what David spent on property taxes. They were touring a housing development that David's foundation had helped fund, a complex of 300 units for low-income families in San Jose, when James said something that struck David hard. "You know what the hardest part of this work is?" James said. "It's not the money, though we always need more. It's that people look at a building like this," he gestured at the clean, simple apartment buildings around them, "and they don't see it as beautiful. They see it as utilitarian, functional, cheap. But 300 families will live here. Kids will grow up here. Lives will be shaped here. To me, that's more beautiful than any mansion. But our culture doesn't value it the same way." David thought about his institute, sitting on its hill in Woodside, magnificent and admired. And he thought about these apartment buildings, which would house far more people and change far more lives, but would never be celebrated in architecture magazines or visited by tourists. "I spent $600 million on a building that serves maybe 100,000 visitors a year," David said. "Most of them wealthy enough to afford the admission and the drive to Woodside. How many units of affordable housing could 600 million have built?" James smiled slightly. "I've done the math. About 4,000 units, maybe 5,000 depending on location and construction costs. Housing for roughly 12 to 15,000 people. But I'm not going to guilt you about the Institute. Beauty and culture matter too. The world needs museums and parks and public spaces, not just housing. The question is about balance, about what we prioritize." That conversation stayed with David. He couldn't undo the Institute. It existed. It was serving a purpose, and despite everything, he was still proud of what they'd created. But James was right about priorities and balance. David had spent 5 years and $600 million on a project driven primarily by ego and nostalgia. What could he accomplish in the next 5 years if he approached problems with the same intensity but better motives? He started to notice things he'd been blind to before. The homeless encampments visible from the highway on his drive to the Institute. The teachers at his kids' school talking about buying their own supplies because the budget didn't cover basics. The news stories about families choosing between rent and food, about medical bankruptcies, about the grinding stress of economic precarity that most Americans lived with daily. He'd always known these problems existed intellectually, but they'd felt abstract, distant from his life. Now they felt urgent and personal in a way they hadn't before. Maybe it was because his own quest for significance had failed in revealing ways. Maybe it was Emma's pointed questions about fairness and consumption. Maybe it was just getting older and realizing that the legacy that mattered wasn't architectural, but human. The lives you touched, the problems you helped solve, the small ways you made the world less cruel. Sarah noticed the shift in his focus. "You're becoming the person I always thought you could be," she said one evening. "Not the person who builds monuments to himself, but the person who actually does something useful with what he has." "Better late than never," David offered. "Much better late than never." The Institute's 3rd anniversary celebration in May 2027 was a major event. They'd completed the contemporary wing, which had won several architectural awards for its design. Attendance was up to 200,000 visitors annually. The educational programs were reaching thousands of students. By any measure, it was a success. David gave a speech at the gala, and he was honest in a way that surprised the audience of donors and dignitaries. "When I started this project 7 years ago," he said, "I had the wrong motivations. I wanted to build something grand because I wanted to be seen as grand. I wanted to recreate the achievements of the robber barons because I envied their permanence, their ability to reshape the landscape to their vision. What I learned is that I was chasing a fantasy. The world that made places like Waddesdon Manor possible is gone, and good riddance to it. It was a world of immense inequality, rigid class structures, and exploitation disguised as grandeur." He could see some uncomfortable shifting in the audience, but he continued, "That doesn't mean beauty and culture don't matter. They do. The Institute serves a real purpose, and I'm proud of what we've built here. But if I could go back and talk to my younger self, I'd tell him to think smaller and more directly about impact. $600 million could have housed thousands of families, educated tens of thousands of students, or funded medical research that might save lives. Instead, I built a museum that's beautiful and worthwhile, but fundamentally serves people who already have access to culture and beauty." He paused, looking around the great hall at the well-dressed crowd. "I don't regret the Institute, but I've learned from it. The next 600 million I spend will be spent differently, on projects that address urgent needs rather than aesthetic desires. And I'd encourage all of you to think about the same questions. What are we building with our wealth and privilege? Who does it serve? What world are we creating? Because the era of grand estates is over, not just because the social infrastructure collapsed, but because we finally started asking whether monuments to individual wealth are what our society needs." The speech received polite applause, but David could tell it had made people uncomfortable. Several donors approached him afterward with carefully neutral comments, but a few thanked him for his honesty, and James Chen, who'd been invited, told him it was the best speech he'd ever heard from a billionaire. "You just did something most wealthy people never do," James said. "You questioned the fundamental premise. That took guts." In the years that followed, David kept his word. His foundation shifted focus dramatically toward direct intervention in affordable housing, education access, and health care. He still supported cultural institutions, including the Institute, but it was no longer the primary focus. He worked with James and others who dedicated their lives to these problems, learning to be useful rather than trying to lead. Emma went to college and studied environmental science, as interested as ever in sustainability and justice. Michael developed a passion for architecture and urban planning, inspired partly by the Institute, but more by thinking about how to design cities that worked for everyone, not just the wealthy. Both kids had seen their father's journey from hubris to humility, and it shaped their own values in ways David was proud of. Sarah launched her own initiative focused on financial literacy for low-income families, leveraging her background in economics and her insider's view of how wealth actually worked. She was good at it, making complex financial concepts accessible and helping people navigate systems designed to be confusing. David still visited the Institute occasionally, walking through the galleries and gardens that he'd spent so much to create. It was beautiful. Visitors seemed to genuinely enjoy it. The programs were making a difference for students interested in art and architecture. But he no longer saw it as his legacy. It was just a building, one project among many, not the defining achievement of his life. His real legacy, he'd come to believe, would be harder to measure and less visible. It would be in the housing units that sheltered families, the students whose educations were funded, the medical treatments that were made accessible. It would be in his kids and how they chose to live their lives. It would be in the conversations he'd started about wealth and responsibility and what we owe each other. One afternoon in 2030, David was giving a tour of a new affordable housing development to a group of potential donors for James's nonprofit. The complex housed 500 families in a Bay Area suburb, built on land that had been a failed shopping mall. It was well designed, not luxurious, but dignified, with community spaces and green areas where kids could play. The architect had done thoughtful work within the tight budget. One of the donors, a woman named Rebecca, who'd sold her company for several $100 million, looked around and said, "This is great, but I wish it was more impressive, you know? Something that would really stand out." David understood the impulse. He'd felt it himself once. "If you want impressive," he said, "go visit the Cohen Institute. It's 45 minutes from here, classical architecture, beautiful gardens, very photogenic. But this," he gestured at the apartment buildings around them, "this is more important. 500 families have stable housing because of this project. Kids can focus on school instead of worrying about being evicted. Parents can save money instead of spending every penny on rent. That's not impressive in the way a palace is impressive, but it changes lives in ways a palace never could." Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. "I guess I'm at the stage you were at 7 years ago, wanting to build something with my name on it, something grand." "There's nothing wrong with wanting to build things," David said. "The question is what you're building and why. If you want your name on something, put it on this housing complex. Future residents won't care about classical architecture or grand staircases, but they'll care about having a safe, affordable place to live." Rebecca ended up funding another housing development, and she did put her name on it, the Rebecca Kim Family Residences, 300 units in Oakland. David went to the ribbon-cutting ceremony and remembered the opening gala for his institute 3 years earlier. Same champagne, same speeches, but serving a completely different purpose. He thought about Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild, who'd built Waddesdon Manor in the 1870s as a showpiece of wealth and taste. Ferdinand had never married, had no children, and spent his fortune building and filling his château with treasures. When he died in 1898, he left it to his sister, who left it to another family member, and eventually it ended up with the National Trust. Ferdinand's legacy was a beautiful building that tourists visited, preserved as an artifact of a vanished era. That was fine. The world needed beautiful buildings, but David had learned that it also needed housing and schools and hospitals. It needed solutions to grinding, mundane problems that killed people slowly through stress and deprivation. Those solutions weren't photogenic. They didn't win architecture awards. They wouldn't be featured in coffee table books about great estates. But they mattered more. The final piece of David's education came in 2031, when he was asked to speak at a conference on wealth and philanthropy. The organizers wanted him to talk about the Institute and his pivot toward more direct charitable work. He agreed, but asked if he could also bring James and Patricia to represent different perspectives on the same themes. The three of them sat on stage together at a hotel ballroom in front of several hundred wealthy donors and foundation officers. The moderator asked David to tell the story of the Institute, why he'd built it, and what he'd learned. David told the story honestly, not sugarcoating his initial motivations or the social backlash he'd faced. He talked about the pandemic's effect on the project and on his thinking. He described the pivot from personal palace to public museum, and his gradual realization that even the museum version was a compromise that satisfied his ego more than any pressing social need. "But here's what I want you to understand," he said. "The reason billionaires stopped building mansions like Waddesdon Manor isn't primarily about money or even social acceptability. It's because we finally started questioning the premise. Why should immense wealth manifest in personal palaces? Who does that serve? What problems does it solve?" He gestured to Patricia and James. "Dr. Valdez runs an institution that serves 200,000 people annually and employs 100 staff. It's valuable work. But James's organization has housed 15,000 people in the past 5 years. Same rough budget, completely different impact. Both matter, but they matter in different ways and at different scales." Patricia picked up the hue.
"Fred, I think there's room for both. Culture and beauty are real human needs. But David's right that we've over-indexed on monuments and under-indexed on meeting basic needs. The great estates of the past were built in societies with immense poverty and suffering. They were beautiful islands in seas of misery. Maybe the lesson is that we shouldn't build monuments until we've solved the basic problems. Or maybe we build both, but we're honest about the trade-offs." James added his perspective. "What strikes me about the old estates is how much labor they required. Dozens of servants, groundskeepers, craftsmen working full-time to maintain them. That labor model was only possible because of extreme inequality. People had no choice but to work as servants for low wages. Today, we have labor protections and minimum wages and the expectation that work should provide dignity. That makes the old estate model economically unviable. You can't maintain a 60,000 square foot mansion and its grounds without either massive ongoing expense or exploiting workers. The economics just don't work anymore, and that's actually progress." The moderator asked David if he regretted the Institute. "No," he said. "I learned things through that process that I needed to learn. I discovered the limits of what money can do, what it can't do, and what it shouldn't try to do. I'm proud of what we created, but I'm more proud of what I've done since. And if I could go back and advise my younger self, I'd say, visit Waddesdon, appreciate its beauty, learn from its history, but then build something else. Build housing. Build schools. Build things that meet urgent needs rather than satisfying aesthetic desires." Someone in the audience raised their hand and asked, but don't we lose something when billionaires stop building grand things? The palaces and estates of the past are now cultural treasures. Who's going to build the treasures of the future? David smiled. That's the question that haunted me for years. And here's what I eventually understood: the treasures of the future won't look like the treasures of the past. They won't be palaces and estates. They'll be the social infrastructure we build, the systems that house people, educate them, keep them healthy, give them opportunity. Those things don't photograph as well. They don't win architecture awards. But they're what future generations will look back on and judge us by. Patricia added, and culturally, we're learning to find beauty in different things. The modernist houses that wealthy people build today, the glass and steel structures that David once dismissed, they represent a different aesthetic. One that values simplicity, integration with landscape, sustainability. That's an evolution, not a degradation. We don't need to build chateaus anymore because we're creating a different kind of beauty. James brought it back to basics. Look, I'm biased because I work in affordable housing. But from where I sit, the most beautiful thing a billionaire can build is a community where people have stable housing, good schools, access to healthcare, and economic opportunity. That's the palace we should be building, not for one family, but for thousands. And the amazing thing is, it costs less than the old palaces did. David's Institute costs $600 million and serves hundreds of thousands of visitors. For the same money, we could house 12,000 families permanently. The math is pretty clear about which is the better investment. The conversation continued for another hour, ranging across topics from tax policy to the psychology of wealth to the future of philanthropy. But the core insight remained: the age of grand private estates had ended not because billionaires lacked ambition or resources, but because society had evolved beyond the point where such monuments served a valid purpose. After the panel, David stood in the hotel lobby talking with attendees. Many thanked him for his honesty. A few criticized him, suggesting he was virtue signaling or trying to assuage guilt. One man, probably in his 50s and clearly very wealthy based on his watch and suit, said bluntly, "You built your monument and now you're telling the rest of us we shouldn't. That's rich." "You're right," David acknowledged. "There's definitely hypocrisy in my position. I did build my monument. But I'm telling you what I learned from it, which is that monuments are overrated. They satisfy ego but don't solve problems. If you want to build one anyway, I can't stop you. But I can tell you you'll end up where I ended up, realizing it was an expensive way to learn an obvious lesson." The man walked away shaking his head, and David didn't blame him. You couldn't shortcut the learning process. He'd had to go through it himself, had to spend years and hundreds of millions chasing a fantasy before understanding why it was a fantasy.